that he can weather tough times without as much assistance from the government. Somehow, though, over the years, there's developed this perverse scenario where big farmers are receiving the largest share of the farm program payments. We now have the largest 10% of the farmers receiving 70% of those farm payments coming out of the federal treasury. There's nothing wrong with farmers growing an operation bigger, but the taxpayers should not be subsidizing large farming operations to grow even larger, making it very difficult for young farmers to buy land or to rent land to get into the operation. By having reasonable caps on the amount of farm program payments any one farmer can receive, it helps ensure the program meets the intent of assisting small and medium-sized farmers through tough times. My payment reforms essentially say that we'll help farmers up to $250,000 per year, but then the government training wheels come off. These new caps will also help encourage the next generation of rural Americans to take up farming. I am approached time and again about how to help young people get into farming. When large farmers are able to use farm program payments to drive up the cost of land and rental rates, our farm programs end up hurting those that they're intended to help. It's simply good policy to have a hard cap on the amount a farmer or farm entity can receive in farm program payments. And while both bodies of Congress have decided to cap farm payments, crop insurance is still available to large operations, no limits on indemnities. Sections 1603 and 1604, which I authored and which Congressman Fortenberry authored in our current farm bill, set the overall payment caps at $250,000 for married couples. Now, in my home state of Iowa, many people would say that that's still too high. On the other hand, there's other farmers in other parts of the country say it's way too low. But I recognize that agriculture can look different around the country, so this is a compromise. Just as important, however, to setting a hard cap on payments is closing loopholes that have allowed non-farmers to game the farm program. The House and Senate farm bills also end the ability of non-farmers to abuse what is known as the actively engaged test. In essence, the law says one has to be actively engaged in farming to qualify for farm payments. Now, isn't that common sense? However, this has been exploited by people who have virtually nothing to do with farming, with a farming operation, and yet receive payments from the farm program. Now, not citing myself, but the Congressional Accountability Office issued a report that I released October, outlining how the current actively engaged regulations are so broad that they essentially are unenforceable. And those comments came from the USDA employees who administer the program. The report illustrated that one farming entity had 22 total members, of which 16 were deemed, quote, contributing actively personal management only to the farm. What does active personal management only mean? That means they are becoming eligible for farm programs because one of the 8 overly broad and unenforceable eligibility requirements that currently exist. More simply put, they likely aren't doing any labor and are nothing more than a participant on paper to allow the entity to get more government payments. Our nation has over a $17 trillion debt. We cannot afford to simply look the other way and let the people abuse a farm safety net. I mentioned earlier how we need to assess some of the challenging areas of farm policy as we look to pass a 5-year farm bill, and some tough decisions need to be made. However, my reforms to payment limits do not pose a tough decision. They are common sense. They are necessary reforms that are included in both the House and Senate versions of the Farm Bill. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Senator Stabenow, the chairman of our Senate committee, for fighting for these Senate provisions. You see, these provisions were part of the Senate bill, so representing a majority of the United States Senate. More importantly, these same provisions were added on the House floor by Congressman Fortenberry of Nebraska on an overwhelming majority. So Senator Stabenow has a high moral ground in conference with the House conferees in fighting for payment limitations. She represents a majority of the United States Senate, whereas the House conferees, in opposing her, represent the minority of the House of Representatives. And now on the last issue I'm going to speak about, and then I'll yield the floor, deals with some correspondence I'm trying to have with the nominee to be head of the Secretary of Homeland Security. On July the 12th, Secretary Napolitano announced that she'd be leaving the Department of Homeland Security after 4 years heading up one of the largest departments of the federal government. On October the 17th, the Obama administration announced that it had finally found a replacement. The Committee on Homeland Security moved quickly on Jay Johnson's nomination, approving him by voice vote on November the 20th. On November the 15th, before the committee approved him, I sent a letter to Mr. Johnson, along with several colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. We on the Judiciary Committee asked for his views on a number of important matters, including our nation's immigration policies and the fair treatment of whistleblowers. We asked if he would cooperate with us on oversight matters and work with us to improve immigration policies going forward. Because the Judiciary Committee has primary responsibility on immigration matters, it is necessary for us to know any nominee's position on almost any issue. It has been nearly a month, and there has been no response to our letter and no indication that he might respond. In fact, I would be surprised that any nominee would respond to Congress anymore, given the majority only needs a simple majority to vote for confirmation. Thanks to a rule change done unilaterally by the majority, there will no longer be a proper vetting of executive branch nominees. The rule change essentially takes away the Senate's constitutional role of advise and consent, thereby allowing nominees to ignore Congress on issues of extreme importance, such as immigration. But I'm still going to pursue these questions, even though we don't have the leverage we used to have when a 60-vote majority was necessary, because Congress has a responsibility to know how laws are going to be enforced by the President's appointees. President Obama promised that this would be the most transparent administration in history, yet getting answers from this President or his administration on legitimate congressional oversight has been like pulling teeth. They have stonewalled Congress at every turn. Over the last 5 years, the administration has gone around Congress and pushed the envelope with their authority. He has ignored his constitutional duty to faithfully execute the laws by picking and choosing which laws he wants to enforce. Congressional oversight, an important responsibility that holds the government accountable for its people, has been nearly impossible. In other words, the checks and balances of government don't work the way the Constitution writers intended. And now it's going to get worse. There will be more blatant disrespect for checks and balances than we've ever seen. So I would like to take a time to read some of the questions, just some of the questions that we asked Mr. Johnson. I hope you think that these would be reasonable questions, that any secretary ought to tell us what he's going to do if he gets sworn into that office. I think they underscore how important it is that we have answers before we move forward on the nomination. First and foremost, we asked Mr. Johnson about his commitment to uphold the laws on the books. We asked if he would continue the lawless policies created by the former secretary and her deputies. We asked about what he would do to improve the morale of immigration officials and agents who are concerned about their non-enforcement protocols. And we want to know how he would strengthen cooperation between the Fed and local law enforcement entities. Second, we asked Mr. Johnson about what he would do to improve border security. We want to know what specific measures he will implement to ensure the department will comply with the Secure Fence Act of 2006. In 2010, Secretary Napolitano suspended our nation's only comprehensive border security measurements, known as Operational Control Metric. More than 3 years have passed, and the Department of Homeland Security has failed to replace that metric. Will Mr. Johnson then hold the department accountable by regularly releasing a comprehensive border security metric? Will he commit to achieving operational control of the borders as required by our law? We do not know that. We would expect him to answer that he's going to enforce the laws, but will he? Will he answer even? Individuals who overstay their visas account for about 40% of the undocumented population of this country. This presents a national security risk. Without a biometric exit system, this country will have no clue who remains on our soil here undocumented. Will Mr. Johnson make it a priority to finally implement the entry-exit system that Congress mandated in 1996, still not being enforced? Third, will we ask about the culture of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service? In January 2012, the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General released a report criticizing the U.S. CIS for pressuring its employees to rubber stamp applications for immigration benefits. In that report, nearly 25% of the U.S. CIS officers surveyed and supervisors had pressured them to improve applications that should have been denied. We want to know if he'll take measures to better screen applicants and do away with the get-to-yes philosophy. That get-to-yes philosophy is a gigantic risk to our national security. Just look at the EB-5 program, which allows foreign nationals to obtain green cards if they invest in the United States. We ask about whether he'd make it a priority to improve that program. We asked Mr. Johnson about his position on immigration reform, especially since a bill passed the Senate and the House could act, sending a bill to the President. We asked if people who are in the country illegally in removal proceedings or subject to an order of removal should be eligible for immigration benefits, including legal status. We asked whether illegal immigrants convicted of a felony or convicted of multiple misdemeanors should be eligible for benefits, including legal status. We want to know if gang members, drunk drivers, domestic abusers, and other criminals should be allowed to stay in the country. It's important for us to know from Mr. Johnson because the Senate bill provides a way for these lawbreakers to gain citizenship, and Mr. Johnson may be responsible for implementing that. Finally, we ask Mr. Johnson to comment on issues generally impacting the department. We ask if he would pledge to cooperate with congressional oversight efforts and be responsive to all congressional requests for information and do it in a timely manner. We ask that because we have received very little cooperation in the last 5 years from that department. We ask if he believes whistleblowers who know of the problems with matters of national security should be prevented from bringing that information to Congress. We ask if he would commit to ensuring that every whistleblower is treated fairly and that those who retaliate against whistleblowers be held accountable. No matter what department one manages, the answers to these questions are very important and should be simple to answer. We need a secretary that is well-versed on these issues. We need a secretary who will implement policies that truly protect the homeland. We need cooperation, transparency. We need answers. In other words, what's wrong to expect answers to these questions I just gave to you before we advise and consent to this nomination? Majority Leader Reid has indicated through his cloture petition on Mr. Johnson that answers to these critically important issues are not warranted. But senators cannot consent to just anyone to head this department. We should not fail our constitutional responsibilities of advice and consent. This body should not move forward with this nomination, and I encourage my colleagues to consider these issues when the cloture vote ripens. I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Alexander.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, all post-cloture time on the Pillard nomination be considered expired, and the Senate vote to proceed on confirmation of Pillard nomination. Upon disposition of the Pillard nomination, the mandatory quorum required under Rule 22 be waived with respect to the cloture motion on the Feldblum nomination, and the Senate proceed to vote on the nomination to invoke cloture on the Feldblum nomination. That if cloture is invoked on the Feldblum nomination, all post-cloture time be yielded back, and the Senate proceed to vote on confirmation of Feldblum nomination. Finally, that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and President Obama be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? The Senator from Iowa.
I object, and I'd like to state the reason I object.
The objection is heard. The Senator's time has expired.
Mr. President, I would ask consent that the Senator be allowed to speak for whatever time he feels appropriate.
Without objection.
The reason I object for the majority, or for the minority, is to moving these votes. I think that we should follow what regular order we have left on nominations, especially after the way that the majority changed the rules on nominations 2 weeks ago. I yield the floor.
President,
The Majority Leader.
my friend, the distinguished senior senator from Iowa, is what we're talking about here. The face of obstruction, not him, but the Republican caucus. Stalling for no reason other than to stall for time. No wonder the rules were changed. No wonder the American people look at the Senate as a dysfunctional body. A couple of weeks ago, we voted to make it a functional body so that nominations can be confirmed for any president. The president deserves to have his team. We have been wasting days, weeks, and months on nominations. We have scores of people, positions that need to be filled. We're only dealing here with a handful. But so people understand the rules. We've changed a few of the rules the last couple of Congresses. Very little, but we've changed them. But if you have a Supreme Court justice, or you have a cabinet officer, or someone on that level, they get 30 hours of time following the cloture vote. And what are they supposed to do during that 30 hours? Come and explain their position, why they oppose a person. Now, Mr. President, for virtually every one of these nominations, there hasn't been a single complaint about any of them. Now, this culminated by virtue of the Republicans in the Senate making a decision that people who serve in the prestigious D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals weren't entitled to have a full court. There's 8 there now. They said that's enough. That is, some say, the most important court in America. Some say more important than the Supreme Court. And the Republicans arbitrarily have said, we're not going to fill those spots. Not because of the qualifications, not because of their education, their experience, their integrity, just because they don't want them filled. Now that's a new low. Now, Mr. President, I'm disappointed to have to inform the presiding officer and all senators tonight that because of this, that is because the Republicans are wasting time, all this staff around here, police officers, all this staff, and, you know, Mr. President, some of them are getting paid overtime. Why? Because the Republicans are wanting to waste more of this body's time, this country's time. I repeat, no wonder the American people feel about the Senate as they do, because of the obstruction that's taken place, unprecedented, for 5 years. So we're going to continue to work tonight, remain in session as long as we need to. Republicans are forcing us to waste a week on nominees this week they know will be confirmed. Every one of them will be confirmed. There are no objections to the qualifications of these nominees, with rare exception, and there are only little squeaks here and there about what could be wrong with them. And the outcome of each and every vote that we will take over the next few days is a foregone conclusion. Yet Republicans insist on wasting time simply for the sake of wasting time. There's no reason these votes couldn't take place right now or in the morning. And we could move to some important things. Mr. President, I have senators come to me all the time. The chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee was here a few minutes ago, the distinguished junior senator from Vermont. He has some important things that he wants to move on this floor. They've passed some things in the House, and that doesn't happen very often, but they passed something over there. They sent it over here dealing with veterans. He wants to bring that to the floor, have a debate on it, offer an amendment to it. Can't do that because we are wasting time here on this senselessness. The junior senator from the state of Delaware is here. He has spent weeks and weeks on manufacturing, which has shown some promise here in America in the last few years. Jobs are being created. He, working on a bipartisan basis with other senators, they have legislation they want to bring to this floor to talk about ways of improving manufacturing capabilities and capacity in the United States. We can't do that. We are here post-cloture, looking at each other, doing basically nothing, as we've done for vast amounts of time because of Republicans' obstructionism. The senator is, yes, she's here, the senator from the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee. I had a meeting with her and the junior senator from the state of Delaware, Rhode Island, just a few minutes ago. Mr. President, in the world today, we have something called climate change. It's here. Climate is changing all over the world. We have global warming. Are we doing anything legislatively to address that? No, nothing. She has a portfolio of legislation that she would like to take care of. And there is going to be zero done because we're sitting here under these lights complaining about, again, about wasting time, of the Republicans wasting time. We could finish these votes now, but we're going to work into the weekend. Now, we had a break for Thanksgiving. It was very, very pleasant for me. I'd be home for 2 weeks. Unfortunately, I had a death in the family that put a little cloud over things, and that's an understatement. Christmas is coming. Everyone should know that we are going to work till we finish stuff we have before us this week. I'm going to file on a number of other nominees as soon as I get a chance, and we're going to finish those. If we have to work the weekend before Christmas, we're going to do that. If we have to work Monday before Christmas, we're going to do that. If we have to work through Christmas, we're going to do that. Because I know the game they're playing. They've done it before. A lot of these nominations will have to be sent, not have to be, but they will ask that they be sent back to the administration. And we'll have to start all over on those again. But some of them we're not going to start all over again. We need a director of the Internal Revenue Service. I think that's a pretty good idea. We need to fill Chairman Bernanke's spot at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. I think that would be important for us with all the problems we have financially. We're going to do that before we leave. And if it takes, we work right through Christmas, we will work right through Christmas. And even if we're standing around most of the time, as we've done a lot during the last 5 years, because of their obstructionism, looking at the lights, and that's about all we have to look at because we're not looking at substantive legislation as we should be. The only impediment to holding votes without delay and at reasonable hours is blatant partisan Republican obstructionism. It's difficult to imagine a more pointless exercise than spending an entire week wasting and waiting for a vote. This is a foregone conclusion what's going to happen every one of these votes. This is exactly the kind of blatant obstructionism and delay that has ground the Senate to a halt and prevented Congress from doing work for the people over the last 5 years. I remind members that without cooperation, there will be roll call votes to perhaps after midnight tonight and as early as 5:30 in the morning. With just a little cooperation, the Senate can stop wasting time and resources. The only way the Senate can stop wasting time is if we get some reasonableness and clarity from the Republicans. Now, if there were ever an example of why the rules had to be changed here and how we tried during two successive Congresses to be reasonable, remember the exercise. Judges would only be opposed under extraordinary circumstances. There isn't a single judge that this man that's President of the United States has nominated that has problems that are extraordinary. So I think it's a shame, Mr. President, what is going on here.
The Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I came to the floor today to speak to a bipartisan bill, which I hope to take a few minutes and talk to. But first, I have to comment on what's going on here or not going on here on the floor and the comments of the Majority Leader. I've just been a senator for only 3 years. As you know well, as the presiding officer, we were sworn in as a group of those elected in the class of 2010. And I just came from an inspiring event where the Vice President, who previously held this seat on behalf of Delaware, gave an award to the former Majority Leader, a real patriot, a veteran, former Senator Bob Dole. And they talked about how compromise, principled compromise, made it possible for Senator McGovern and Senator Dole, folks from opposite ends of the political spectrum, to work together in the interest of hungry children here in the United States. And frankly, what I've seen in the 3 years that I've been here in the Senate, the 3 years that we have served together on the Judiciary Committee, has been a slow walk. There are minority rights in this body, but there are also minority responsibilities. There are majority rights, but also majority responsibilities. And I just wanted to add to the comments of the Majority Leader that the nominees to serve on the D.C. Circuit, the nominees to many, many district court seats, whose confirmations I've either presided over or attended, were not objected to on substantive grounds. And I have real trouble with the idea that the 3 empty seats on the D.C. Circuit do not need to be filled. I have listened to at great length the arguments about caseload and about workload. And as the chair of the Court Subcommittee of Judiciary, I presided over the presentation of the Judicial Conference's report on where we need additional judgeships and where we don't. And I'll just note briefly and in passing that Judge Timkovich, who presented this report, did not suggest there was some need to reduce the D.C. Circuit by eliminating these currently vacant spots. We could go through this chapter and verse. This has been debated to death here on this floor. But in my view, we have 3 excellent, qualified candidates. I regret that we have spent so much time burning the clock and that we have had to make changes that ultimately will make it possible for qualified nominees to be confirmed. It is, to me, a subject of some deep concern that we cannot work better together, Republican and Democrat, to move things forward. And if I might, I'd like to move for a moment to an example of exactly the sort of bipartisan bill that we should be able to move to here. That if there weren't this endless obstruction, if we weren't running out the clock on nothing, we might be able to get done together. An example of the sort of reaching across the aisle that used to dominate this body when giants like Dole and McGovern served here, and are no longer the case. They are no longer the daily diet of this body. We are no longer reaching across the aisle and finding ways to make our country more competitive, to create more manufacturing jobs in partnership with the private sector, to responsibly reduce our deficit. I was encouraged, as a member of the Budget Conference Committee, that we seem to be moving towards enacting a significant, small in scale, but significant in its precedence, a deal for the Budget Committee that could allow us to go back to regular order for appropriations. But here, as we waste hour after hour burning out the clock to confirm nominees, I wonder, Mr. President, whether we're going to be able to take up, consider, and pass substantive legislation. If I might, for a few minutes, I came to the floor today initially to talk about the power of children's advocacy centers. Children's advocacy centers exist today across the country in large part because this Congress, on a bipartisan basis, passed back in 1990 the Victims of Child Abuse Act, a bill that for the first time authorized funding for an important nationwide network of what are called children's advocacy centers. These centers help deliver justice. They help heal victims of violence and abuse. And we must act to continue empowering their service to our nation. And today is a time when we could work together to reauthorize that initial landmark bill from 1990 and rededicate ourselves on a bipartisan basis to something that I think is one of our most sacred obligations, protecting our children, protecting the victims of child abuse and delivering justice for them. That's what this bipartisan bill does that was introduced earlier today, along with my colleagues, Senators Blunt and Sessions and Hirono, a great example of being able to work together across the aisle. Mr. President, as parents, as neighbors, as leaders of our nation, we have no more sacred obligation than protecting our children. And in most of our cases, we dedicate everything we have as parents to ensuring our children's safety, to providing for their future. And that's what this bill is all about that responsibility. Tragically, too often, despite our best efforts, too many of our children fall victim to abuse. And we cannot guarantee their safety. But what we can do is ensure that when children in this country are harmed, that we can deliver justice without further harming them. Thankfully, children's advocacy centers, for which this bill reauthorizes funding, are critical and effective resources in our communities that help us perform this awesome and terrible responsibility. Through this bill, we can continue to prevent future tragedies and deliver justice in ways that are effective and less costly than communities can deliver alone. This bill helps prevent child abuse proactively. Just last year, its programs trained more than 500,000 Americans, mostly in school settings, in how to spot and prevent child sexual abuse. Second, in my view, most importantly, this bill delivers justice. Children's advocacy centers increase prosecutions of the monsters who perpetrate child abuse. One study showed a 94% conviction rate for center cases that carry forward to trial. And third, in many ways equally importantly, this bill helps to heal. Child victims of abuse who receive services at a child's advocacy center are 4 times more likely to receive the medical exams and the mental health treatment that they desperately need compared to children who are served by non-center supported communities. No parent would ever want to have to go to one of these places or have to bring their child to one of these places. But those parents who have, under these tragic circumstances, nearly 100% of them say that they would recommend seeking help to other parents. So how do these advocacy centers achieve all these different results of prevention, of justice, and of healing? Well, they're unique because they bring together under one roof everybody who needs to be present to help deal with the tragedy of child abuse: law enforcement, prosecutors, mental health and child service professionals, all focused on what is in the best interest of the child. Through a trained forensic interviewer, they interview the child to find out exactly what happened. They ask difficult and detailed questions, and they structure the conversation in a trained and non-leading way so that the testimony can be used later in court, preventing what otherwise is re-traumatization, making it possible for child victims to testify in a way that will lead to justice, but without forcing those children to take the stand and to repeat over and over what they testified to once at a center. Prosecutors take the information obtained in the interview and they take it all the way through the court system, while doctors and other child service professionals ensure the child's getting the help he or she badly needs, and to begin the process of healing. One place, one interview, all the resources a victim would need to move forward to secure justice and to heal. In my home state of Delaware, we have 3 children's advocacy centers, 1 in each of our counties. And in the last year, I visited the centers in Wilmington and in Dover and saw firsthand the extraordinary work that the professionals there do. These are places haunted by the tragedies that are described and recorded there. But the staff are welcoming, nurturing professionals, and the law enforcement and mental health and child service professionals who are there are deeply dedicated to making sure that they achieve justice and they promote healing. It was striking on my tours, my visits, to see how strategically and thoughtfully each of these centers has been put together, how they had worked through every possible detail to enable obtaining the testimony needed to secure justice while enabling healing of child victims. This is critical in order to avoid re-traumatization, a threat that is real for victims and for their long-term healing process. The centers in Wilmington, in Dover, and Georgetown, in my home state, show over and over again how these centers create the sort of nurturing but effective space to ensure that we both meet the needs of victims and secure justice. Mr. President, as I know you know, in my home state of Delaware, just a few years ago, we saw exactly the kind of evil we most dread in this world, when a pediatrician, a man named Earl Bradley, who many, many Delawareans trusted with their children's health and safety, was found to have sexually assaulted more than 100 of our children. Delaware is a state of neighbors, and his horrific crimes against our children, our families, and our communities affected all of us. And our Attorney General, Beau Biden, and his team effectively led the investigation and prosecution of this monster. Thankfully, children's advocacy centers were able to play a key role in ensuring that the interviews and the assistance provided to the victims and their families were effective and that ultimately justice was rendered. As Randy Williams, the executive director of Delaware's Children's Advocacy Center in Dover, wrote to me, quote, "Our multidisciplinary team worked tirelessly and seamlessly in providing forensic interviews, assessments, medical evaluations, and mental health services for every child referred to our centers." Randy went on to say, "I feel confident that our team's outstanding collaborative response was a direct result of the financial and technical assistance and training resources made possible over many years through the federal Victims of Child Abuse Act." In the end, Dr. Bradley was convicted on multiple accounts. Over 100 victims were involved, and he is now serving 14 life sentences plus 164 years in prison. Mr. President, as a nation, in my view, we have no greater responsibility than to keep our children safe. As a father, there is nothing that keeps me up at night more than concerns about the safety and security and health of my own children. We must do everything we can to prevent sexual abuse of those most vulnerable and those most precious members of our society, our children. And when that tragedy strikes, we need to be prepared with the best services we have to foster healing and deliver justice. This specific bill is about upholding our responsibility to our children, to our families, and to this nation's future. It is at the very core of why we serve and of what we believe. I am grateful that this is a bipartisan bill, that this is a bill that can demonstrate the best of what this Senate, this Congress, and this country is capable of. It represents the best of our federal commitment to targeted, effective, and essential assistance to state and local law enforcement, to our communities, and to our children. Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to join with us because in the end, no child should fall prey to physical or sexual abuse. No mother or father should have the haunting experience of finding that an adult they trusted took advantage of that trust and horribly hurt their child. And no country should tolerate these crimes when there are things we can do now, today, on a bipartisan basis to protect and to heal our children and to ensure that justice is secured. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
I came to the floor to talk about several other things, but after hearing the majority leader and my colleague from Delaware, I think the revisionist history needs to stop. You know, this place ran until 1917 under a process where any one senator could stop anything. And that was changed by a two-thirds majority of those present voting to a number less than that, and then through a period of time. The point I'm getting to is we're in this process because the rules weren't good enough to accomplish what the majority wanted to accomplish and the majority leader wanted to accomplish. Majority Leader Byrd didn't have any trouble when he had the same vote number. Majority Leader Daschle didn't have any trouble. Frist, Dole, none of them had any trouble. Matter of fact, we've seen what has happened. It's the lack of effective leadership in building bipartisanship. The Senate wasn't designed to be the House, as you all have recently made it. The Senate was designed to protect absolutely minority rights. And what happened the week before we went on Thanksgiving break actually hurt you more than it hurt the minority, because you've now lost the ability to hold your own administration accountable. The majority leader said reasonableness and clarity. Reasonableness is compromise. Reasonableness is allowing to have amendments on major bills. Clarity is the ability of senators to offer their viewpoint on $600 billion bills. Reasonableness would be to say that every member of this body ought to be able to contribute important ideas to the defense authorization bill or to the farm bill or to any other major piece of legislation. So we've gone down a road. It can be stopped. All this can be stopped. But it cannot be stopped without the recognition of the damage done to this body by the very frivolous act. The revisionist history I'm talking about is with the D.C. court. There's no difference in what the president's doing on the D.C. court than what Roosevelt decided to do or attempted to do. Everybody knows that the workload there is enormously small compared to all the rest of the courts. Everybody knows there's also judicial vacancies that are much more important than those. What's the reason? Is so that we can continue to have executive orders and bureaucratic rules and regs come through that are going to get challenged because they're not within the consent and the vision of the laws that are passed, so that in fact they can be enforced by a stacked court. You can't claim anything other than that. We know that's what's going on. You know that's what's going on. And that's going to be there forever. That's a legacy of the Obama administration. And it's a planned legacy. So it's not about what is claimed to be Republican obstructionism. It's about changing the very nature of our country. It's about changing the rule of law. It's about whether or not the president will be an emperor or be the president. And my worry is we're moving fast and quickly towards a executive branch that has decided and has been stated so very proudly that if the Congress won't do it, we're going to do it anyway. Where's that fit with the rule of law? And we've heard that 3 times from the president. And in fact, they're doing it, ignoring law. And so now we're going to, the very court where those laws get challenged, we're going to stack it with his nominees. And we refuse to admit that the very same point was made by senior members of the Judiciary Committee when the Republicans were in charge. You can't deny that history. It's out there. Senator Schumer did it, as well as others, knowing that that court should not be filled. We know it's going to get filled. We understand what's up. What's at risk is the future of our country and whether or not we'll really have balance between the powers of the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative branches in this country. And what we're seeing is a reshaping of that. And it's a dangerous trend. It was something our founders worried about. And we've seen executive orders and executive privilege taken to new heights that have never been seen in this country before by this administration. So let's be clear what we're talking about. This isn't about obstructionism. This is about you limited our rights. You also very well limited your own rights in the ability to extract information. You just heard Senator Grassley spend an hour on the floor talking about the lack of response from this administration. There's no tool for you to get answers anymore. There's no tool for any of us to get answers anymore because we can no longer hold any nominations because they'll go through. So there's no power. We've given up one significant power to hold the executive branch accountable. Not only of that, as we've diminished the minority rights that are part of what the founders created to force compromise, to force us to compromise, to bring us together. There's not ill will. There's damaged hearts in this institution today. We understand the strong beliefs on the other side, but we also don't understand the lack of moral fiber that's associated with avoiding and violating what has always been the tradition of the Senate, which is you change rules with two-thirds votes of those duly elected and present voting. Rule 22 still stands. It just has a precedent in front of it. So for the first time in our history, in this body, one group, because they couldn't achieve compromise and wouldn't compromise, have forced a changing of the rules, not through two-thirds of duly elected and sworn members, but by fiat, by a simple majority. What's next? We're going to make it the House? That's what's next. That's coming. I know that's coming. And so consequently, what's going to happen in our country is you're not going to have significant deliberation. We're going to have laws changed at the public whim rather than long-term thinking and an embracing of what the Constitution says. The whole purpose for this body was to be a counter to the House in terms of response to political and public demand, to give reasoned thought and forced compromise so that what came out of here was a blend of what both the public wanted, but also what the public might have lost sight of in terms of a short-term view versus a long-term view. You're putting that at risk. It's coming at risk. The very country, the soul of the country, can unwind right here in the U.S. Senate. So what remaining powers do we have as minority members, and you may get to find that out someday, is to use the rules that are there to our benefit. You know, in the past, nominations were agreed upon between the majority leader and minority leader, and they were ferreted out and moved. Most of these nominations, we've had 21 nominations come through Homeland Security. I voted positively for 19 of them, against one, and voted present on one today. I'd say that's about 90%, that I'm in agreement of moving the nominations. We actually forced compromise on our committee. We actually worked to compromise on our committee. But that's because of the leadership of Senator Carper, to create an atmosphere where you can have compromise and you can have back and forth. We don't have that leadership in the Senate as a whole. The Senate's never seen these problems, but it's not about the rules. It's about the leadership and who's running the place. So we can blame it. Most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle haven't been here for a long period of time. They've never seen it in the majority. They've never seen it work. 77 times a majority leader over the last 7 years has filled the tree and barred amendments. That's more than all the rest of them combined in the entire history of the Senate. Is that about us, or is that about him not wanting to allow the place to work? He's a good man. But the problem is leadership matters. This place is not functioning. My time is for my colleague to come is here, and I will yield the floor. But I will just make one other statement that I think needs to be said. I believe that climate does change. I believe that climate's changing all the time. Global warming has been disputed now. It's undeniable. It's not global warming. We're now into a global cooling period. And that's okay. You can have cooling. But the fact is the science is still nebulous on all the claims that are being made. And I've said before on this floor, I'm not a climate change denier, but I'm a global warming denier because the facts don't back it up now. And so we heard what the majority leader had to say about and the importance of getting things through on climate change. There may be important things we need to do, but we ought to be doing them together rather than in opposition. And if that was the attitude, that we would work together, things would. If we would have an open amendment process, a truly open amendment process, where the majority leader isn't picking our amendments, deciding what we can offer, pretty soon you're going to tell us what we can say on the floor. You're going to determine what I can say on the floor. That's the first step in this process. That's the ultimate conclusion to this process that you have started. So it's about leadership. And it's either there or it isn't. Right now, it's not there, and I yield the floor to my colleague.
Mr. President, Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the comments of the senator from Oklahoma, and I would like to use his comments maybe as a springboard for some thoughts I have, not only on this nomination, but the terrible mess that we find ourselves in today here in the United States Senate. I'm a fairly new member to the Senate. I came here just 5 years ago, thought a lot about re-election, and announced some months ago that I would not seek a second term in the United States Senate. So you might say I don't really have a fighter in this ring. I'm here for a limited period of time. I've already decided that. My interest is seeing the Senate operate that will be in the best interests of our country, that will fulfill the vision that our founders had, a country where there would be freedom, where the minority would be able to voice their view as well as the majority. The process by which the House of Representatives and the United States Senate was put together was a very, very thoughtful process. Our founders looked at our country and its future, and they decided that there needed to be a body where the population would be represented based upon numbers, based upon the population. And that became the House of Representatives. Now, for a state like Nebraska, 200 and some years later, that doesn't work very well. It's pretty obvious that our 3 House members can be consistently, routinely outvoted by a whole bunch of other states. California, New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, Texas, I could go on and on. We have 3 members in the House. It's obvious that we're going to be on the losing end of that. The other piece of that is that it's a majority-based body. So if you're in the majority with the Rules Committee, you pretty well set the rules. It just works that the majority is, as long as they can keep their members together, they're going to win. Just the way it works. And so about the only way you can change that is to change the majority. And so when our founders looked at that, they said, we've got to have a different approach in the United States Senate. And that led to the Great Compromise. Now, Mr. President, what we ended up with is just a remarkable system, if you think about it. If you think about it, Nebraska in the United States Senate is as powerful as California.
Nebraska is as powerful as Pennsylvania because we each get 2 members. We are equally represented. But they also recognize that the pendulum would swing. Sometimes one party would be in control, sometimes another party would be in control. And originally, when the United States Senate was set up, any one member of the body could come to the Senate floor and object, or just debate something to death, and that pretty well was how it operated. And it operated for decades and decades that way. Then came World War I, and senators began to recognize that funding the war was going to be a very serious problem. There was a tremendous amount of affinity between senators and people back in the country where their ancestors came from, Germany. And so they had to find a way to end debate. And so they finally, after discussing this and debating it, decided that the best way of doing that was to put something in place where you could literally take a vote. And I think back then, if my memory serves me correctly, if 2/3 of the senators voted, they could end debate. And that was quite a change for the Senate. The whole idea that a single senator wasn't going to be able to literally force issues in the Senate was a very, very difficult issue. But that change was made, and it operated that way for many decades following that. And then in the 1970s, the decision was made that it would take 60 votes to end debate. They would pull the number down to 60. But it was always recognized that the rules could only be changed by a 2/3 majority. That was until just a few weeks ago. And something happened here in the United States Senate that literally shakes the foundation of this country, and it shakes the foundation of this body. Now, I guess if you're in the majority at the moment, you're probably saying, geez, Mike, it seems to work out pretty well. Well, it won't work out very well for the history of this body, for this institution, for its members, and most importantly, for the citizens of the United States. Because it was the method chosen to change the rules that is the frightening piece of this. Think about this. We came down here a few weeks ago. A ruling was made by the chair, and the majority leader said, I will appeal that ruling. Now, we all know, if we've read the Senate rules, and I hope to goodness we've all read the Senate rules, that appealing the ruling of the chair, you can overrule the chair by a majority vote. Well, let me repeat that. We bypassed the rule that says it takes 2/3 to change the rules of the Senate, and the majority said we will appeal the ruling, and if we get a majority, we will overturn the ruling. And that's what happened. And that's where we find ourselves tonight. Now, this isn't inconsequential, and we're not trying to be arbitrary and capricious, but we're trying to make the point that this is a huge issue for the future of our country. Let me point out what this now means for the United States Senate. What this means is that if the majority leader, whoever that is, Republican or Democrat, does not like the way things are going, they can appeal the ruling of the chair and overturn that ruling by a majority vote, because now the precedent is set. It's in our history. It's in our rules. Now, some look at this and say, well, you need not panic. This only applies to circuit court nominees, district court nominees, and executive appointments. So let's think about that a second, Mr. President. let's say that we have a Supreme Court of the United States where there are 4 members that are pretty consistent in ruling one way, some might call it the liberal way, and you have 4 members that are pretty consistent in ruling another way, some might call it the conservative way, and there's 1 member of the United States Supreme Court that kind of moves back and forth between the 4 over here and the 4 over here, between the 4 liberal members, between the 4 conservative members, whatever you want to call it. And that's a pretty unpredictable vote. And let's say something happens. Maybe there's a health issue. Maybe there's a decision by that member there in the middle to retire. I don't know. Could be a whole host of things. That's the human condition. Things happen to us. And let's say we're in the last 18 months of an administration. President's due to go out. Campaign has already started. You got people showing up in Iowa, and New Hampshire, and South Carolina, and wherever else. They're raising money. They got the presidential races. They're organizing. They're doing all the things they need to do. And you got Republicans thinking, by golly, it's our time. We'll either keep the White House or we'll win the White House. You got Democrats thinking the same thing. And you've got a president that all of a sudden has a Supreme Court appointment and smack dab in the middle of 4 members on one side and 4 members on the other side. And let's say that the majority has the ability to put somebody of their own ilk into that position, whether it's Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative. And they look at this and they say, you know, we could lose the White House, or we may not get the White House. And these are appointments for life. So it's not like we're appointing somebody for 4 years. These are appointments for life. And you know, we've kind of come to the conclusion, as we've talked about it on our side of the aisle, that by golly, it's in the best interest of this country if we can make this appointment. And you know what? We don't have 60 votes to get it done. We've counted the votes. It looks like this is going to come out of the Judiciary Committee on a straight party line vote. What are we going to do now? Mr. President, I know what will happen. You know what will happen. Every member of the United States Senate knows what will happen. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or a conservative or a liberal or a socialist or whatever you want to call yourself. We know what will happen. There'll be a ruling by the chair. There'll be an appeal by the majority leader. And all of a sudden, we'll have a rule where you can make a Supreme Court nomination. You can make a Supreme Court nomination, a job for life, based upon a majority vote. Does anybody think for a minute that that isn't going to happen? Does anybody think for a minute that the circumstances surrounding that won't occur? Now, I guess if you're on the Republican side of the aisle and it's a real strong conservative that's going to the Supreme Court, maybe you look at that and say, thank goodness we saved the country. Maybe if you're a Democrat and it's a good, strong liberal that's going on to the Supreme Court, you say, thank goodness we saved the country. And it was worth it. But you see, Mr. President, here's the dilemma we find ourselves in. The dilemma we find ourselves in is that the majority of this body has now set the precedent, and you can't pull it back. There isn't any way now that you can unwind the clock and turn back the clock. Now let me offer another thought. let's say we're a few years down the road and you've got a piece of legislation, and your side of the aisle has decided that that piece of legislation is absolutely critical for the future of this country. Maybe it's cap and trade. Maybe it's another health care bill. Whatever. And all of a sudden, somebody says, we got to get this done. We're in the last 12 months of this administration. We're looking at the numbers. We're not going to win the White House again the way it's looking. Well, the precedent is there. Appeal the ruling of the chair. You see, Mr. President, the point I'm making here is this. It's not that the rules were changed. The rules have been changed in the Senate a number of times by the way the Senate rules contemplate, with a supermajority voting to change those rules. Now we have torn that up because now we have established a precedent. You know, I am in the process of reading Senator Byrd's history of the Senate. Remarkable man. Got to know him a little bit. He was still here when I came to the Senate before he passed. Happened to be on the other side of the aisle, but I came to respect him so much. He would have never stood for this. He just never would have tolerated that this institution would be so mistreated by anybody, Republican or Democrat. Boy, in his heyday, he would have been at his seat screaming at the top of his lungs about what we were doing to the Senate with this vote, what the majority was going to do to the future of this great body. You know, in his history of the Senate, he talks about how important it is that there is this body where a minority view of the world can be represented. You see, if I were the majority leader, I guess I would like this to run efficiently and well-oiled and smoothly, and I was the governor, I was the mayor. Days when I got my way were much better than days that I didn't get my way. I didn't like being frustrated by the legislature. I didn't like the city council telling me I couldn't get my way. I couldn't understand some days why they couldn't figure out that I was right. And one day I was sitting down with a state senator. He had been there a lot of years, and I was complaining about the way that the legislature was treating me. Couldn't understand why the legislature wouldn't follow everything that the governor wanted done, and he listened very, very patiently, and he looked at me and he said, you know, Mike, nobody elected you king. And I think that's what Bob Byrd would have said. Nobody elected any of us king. You see, our founders set this system up with the whole idea that we wouldn't have kings anymore, that there would be check and balance, and that we would be forced to deal with each other, sometimes more artfully than at other times, but that we would be forced to deal with each other. Now, the majority leader came down here and he said, I don't understand this, and talks about this process. Well, this process got started because he filed cloture on 10 nominations. Why aren't we working on this? If you look at the history of the Senate over the last years, I've been here, I've watched it. I turn on my TV in the office to see what's going on the Senate floor. You know what I see, Mr. President? Exactly what you see, what all of us see. We sit hour after hour after hour in cloture call or in quorum call, hour after hour, when amendments are pending. I thought, I had this mistaken impression that every senator could file an amendment, that if I had a better idea on something, I could file an amendment. I'd get a hearing on the amendment. I'd be able to come down here and try to argue to my colleagues past my amendment. We haven't seen that kind of process for years under this majority. I didn't think it was possible to mishandle the United States Senate when I came here. I looked at the books of rules and interpretations and volumes, chapter after chapter, written about the rules of the Senate, and I said to myself, there's no way you could mismanage this body because these rules are as intricate as they could be. Boy, was I proven wrong. You can mismanage this body. We've seen it. And that's where we find ourselves today. And at the end of the day, why did it happen? Why did it happen? Why are we putting ourselves in this position? You know, a former United States Senator from Nebraska who had been here, I think he was here 3 terms, he had a wonderful saying. When his party wasn't in power, he'd say at speeches, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you, the worm will turn. And it was his way of saying, you know what, I've been in the majority and I've been in the minority. And it will change because the people will send a message into this chamber just like they did on the health care bill. They will send a message that this is not the kind of country that they want. We somehow have to figure out how to put this back in the box. This nuclear option needs to be sealed up, hidden away, and never used again. I don't care if the Republicans are in the majority or the Democrats are in the majority. This basically means today that all of those rules, all of those chapters written about those rules have no meaning whatsoever because there are no rules. If I don't like what's going on here and I am in the majority, all I have to do is appeal the ruling of the chair and get my team to stand together, and we've changed the way the United States Senate operates. And it is as simple as that. You know, I think at times in our history we would like to think that we're the smartest people in the world, that we thought of something that no other person has thought of in the history of this country. Not true. If you read what Senator Byrd wrote about the history of the United States Senate, many times United States senators dissatisfied, losing personally because of a ruling of the chair, had an opportunity to appeal that ruling and win, and realized that was the wrong course of action because they would set a precedent that you could change the rules by breaking the rules. And that's exactly what happened a couple of weeks ago. That's exactly what happened. It isn't the fact that the rule has changed, although I disagree with where we ended up. It is the method by which the majority Democrats have changed those rules. Because that method now is precedent. It is now available to Republicans and Democrats, and it's wide open. I guarantee you, in our lifetime, we will see a Supreme Court nominee put on the Supreme Court by this method. I guarantee you that we will see, whether it's in our lifetime or at some point after, we will see that you will have a situation where legislation is now done by a majority. And what does that mean for the country? Well, let me give you a good example. The Great Compromise protected states like Nevada. It protected states like Nebraska and Iowa. We all get 2 senators. we all get to come to the floor and fight for what we believe in. I will say what I would imagine every United States senator will say. I come from a beautiful state, the state of Nebraska. We are conservative people by nature. I don't think you live in Nebraska unless you have a pioneer spirit and you're conservative by nature. That's who we are. We kind of essentially believe that less government is a good idea. You know, when I was governor, people didn't want me running their schools. They had a school board. They thought they could make thoughtful, intelligent decisions about running their schools. I thought they could too. That's the nature of who we are. Do you realize that now on executive appointments, district court judges and circuit court judges, that basically we get dealt out of this? Let's say that I've got a problem with a nominee, and I want to put a hold on that nominee until they come to my office and deal with me. Everybody on both sides of the aisle gets the opportunity to use that. Well, guess what? You just voted that away a few weeks ago. Why would a Republican administration deal with anyone in the majority, today's majority? Why would they care? It doesn't make any difference. I went through that process. I was a member of the President's cabinet. You know, I hope I would have the decency that if anybody asked me a question, I would answer the question or try to solve their problem or try to work with them. But quite honestly, why do they need to? How can you force that issue now? They don't need your vote. They can get through the process if their party is the majority of the United States Senate. This body was never intended to operate that way. I want to spend a few minutes of my time talking about what I really think this is about. And this makes it an even more tragic story. The Majority Leader was here a few minutes ago and he said, well, you know, if you're going to be like this, then we'll work on Christmas. We'll work the weekend before. We'll work the day before. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, what's new about that? What's even threatening about that? I mean, that's the way business is done. We sit in hours and hours and hours of quorum call, and all of a sudden, 10 nominees you file cloture on 2 weeks before the break. I mean, it's kind of obvious to me. Is it obvious to anybody else what's going on here? They're trying to force the issue. Why didn't we start working on this weeks ago? Why don't you run the Senate 24/7 to move amendments, to give us an opportunity to vote on amendments? Why sit hour after hour in a quorum call? But I think, Mr. President, what this is really all about is this. You see, we had reached an agreement. Remember that evening when we all walked down the hall, Republicans, Democrats, Independents? We went in the old Senate chamber. We shut the doors. No media in there. No staff in there. Just us talking about the Senate. Now, I'm not going to share a lot about what was talked about in there, but I thought it was a pretty good meeting. We've done that a couple of times. We did that on the START Treaty, and we did it on that evening a few months ago. It wasn't very pleasant, but, you know, over the next day or so, we shook hands. We said to each other, okay, we get it. We don't want to get in the business of breaking the rules to change the rules. We understand the precedent that that is setting. Once you put that on the books, like I said, you can't unwind the clock. So, okay, here's what we're going to do. I must admit, I didn't like it very much. I thought we were giving up too much. But having said that, the alternative wasn't very attractive. And we shook hands like gentlemen do, and we called a truce, and those were the rules we would operate under. Everybody said, well, we've dodged a bullet on that one, and the Senate will continue to function like it's functioned the last 225 years as a place where the minority, whoever that might be at any given time, has a voice. Only body in the world that operates like that. Like I said, I must admit I had qualms about it. I talked to some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle about my qualms, and at the end of the day, I reached the conclusion that it was better than the nuclear option. So why did this come up again? If we had reached a deal, if we shook hands like gentlemen and women do, why did this come up again? I thought this was behind us. I thought we would make our way through nominations and work long hours, and, you know, most of these are very non-controversial, and I just thought that we had reached an agreement. Well, we had reached an agreement. We all know we had reached an agreement. So why did the majority, why did Democrats feel that all of a sudden we needed to revisit this? Well, Mr. President, the argument I want to make tonight is this, and I'm going to draw on a little bit of history. When I first came here, I sat in a chair over there. I'll never forget Christmas Eve day when we were brought in here to vote on a piece of legislation. Now, Christmas Eve votes are pretty unusual around here. We all sat at our desk. We don't usually enforce that rule, but we all sat at our desk. And for people like me, I left this chamber very, very sad and discouraged. On a pure party line vote, a monumental piece of legislation that practically no one had read and was poorly understood. In fact, the Speaker said, well, we have to pass this to understand what's in it. No truer words were ever spoken. Passed. Not a single Republican in the House or the Senate voted yes on that legislation. You see, I kind of had the idea when I came here that there'd be give and take, that I'd get my idea, you'd get your idea, and at the end of the day, the Senate was the body that would force compromise where the bill wouldn't pass. But something unusual had happened. The President was a Democrat. The Senate had 60 Democrats, so debate could end, and the majority in the House was overwhelmingly Democrat. And it became very, very clear to me that my view of the world didn't matter, and it wasn't going to matter, because as long as they could sweeten this thing up and do deals and whatever else, my state was impacted by it. We all remember the Cornhusker kickback, but at the end of the day, it passed. I could never figure out how that bill would work. It just didn't make any sense to me. I'd been a governor. I'd seen how failed Medicaid was. 40% of the docs wouldn't take Medicaid. I couldn't imagine how adding millions to that system was going to help poor people. Looked to me like it was going to hurt them. It's kind of like giving them the bus ticket and then saying after they've got the ticket, well, we're only running one bus in Washington, D.C. these days. Well, probably not going to be very, very successful. I looked at what was happening in the rest of the bill, and it just didn't make any sense to me. Well, I think I know why we revisited this rule. Because when the rollout occurred, right about that time, all heck broke loose. Because finally the American people realized how bad this bill was. In fact, there's one state out there, the state of Oregon, they didn't sign up anybody because their system melted down. The exchange was a mess. People found out all of these promises. Remember this one, if you like your plan, you can keep it, period. If you like your plan, you get to keep it, period. Not only was that used on the campaign trail, we all get a little, we all get out on the campaign trail and hyperventilate here and there. But it was used by somebody in real authority, the President of the United States of America, who went to the American people and said, if you like your plan, you can keep it. Now, I said, how's that possibly work? Because the whole idea is you've got to force people off their plan onto a different plan. But if you like your plan, you get to keep it. Well, in 2010, the administration's own rule on this subject showed that as many as 80% of small business plans and 69% of all business plans would lose their grandfathered status. A very, very thoughtful United States Senator, a guy by the name of Mike Enzi, put in a resolution of disapproval which would have canceled that regulation. Back then, he was able to get it to a vote. Now, you would think that if you want to support the president of your party in his promise, his pledge to the American people, if you like your plan, you're going to get to keep it, period, you'd vote with your president. You would think that would be 100 to 0. I don't know how Republicans could be against that. I don't know how Democrats could be against that. After all, that's what this person in authority promised the American people. If you like your plan, you get to keep it, period, he said, over and over and over again. It was like a broken record. You know how that vote went here? Let me remind us, it failed on a party line votes. Democrats voted no on the resolution. If you like your plan, you get to keep it. My goodness, is that an embarrassment or what? What was the message that day? Were they trying to say, no, if you like your plan, you don't get to keep it? The president isn't being truthful with you? Was that the message that day? What was going on? I mean, I was stunned by that vote. How could you be against the president's own promise? That was back in 2010. That information was available to the president and his people back in 2010, and yet they kept saying it. If you like your plan, you get to keep your plan. Well, another estimate by the Congressional Budget Office, which I think generally we all respect, they do good work for us, they do our scoring, said up to 20 million employees could lose their employer-sponsored insurance. Wait a second. That information was available too. So how is this promise worked out? This fall, more than 4.7 million cancellation letters went out in 32 different states. Now, I've read the articles. I imagine everybody in the chambers read the articles. 4.7 million people got cancellation letters in 32 different states. The cancellation letter basically said, well, sorry, this big law got passed on a party line vote and you don't get to keep your plan, just like was predicted by the CBO and the administration's own people. This should not be stunning to anybody in this body, but it was stunning to the American people. Well, the president said, oh my goodness, I think this is a problem. And so he said to insurance companies, you got to fix this. You got to get people their plan. If they like their plan, they get to keep their plan. And it didn't matter whether it was Democrats or Republicans in given states. They said, Mr. President, you can't unwind that clock. And what I would say to that is, wait a second here. I don't like this law, but it passed. I was sitting there the day it passed. It passed on a completely party line vote. And people literally were caught in a situation, millions of them, where they realized they wouldn't get their plan. So, could the president solve that problem? No. It wasn't a policy fix. It was a political fix. That's what he was doing. He was literally trying to solve a political problem for the majority that passed the darn bill. I mean, it's unbelievable. Many weighed in. The American Academy of Actuaries said this, changing the ACA provisions could alter the dynamics of the insurance market, creating two parallel markets operating under different rules, thereby threatening the viability of insurance markets operating under the new rules. Now, boy, I'm as competitive as anybody. I've run a lot of elections. I understand the importance of being in the majority in this body. I especially understand that after what the majority did the last few weeks. You know, we went 225 years as a country, and it was only in the last couple of weeks that the majority said, look, we're tired of dealing with you, minority. We're going to get our own way. It reminded me of that day that Obamacare was passed. Reminded me it was identical. It was identical. It was like, Joe Hance, get lost. We don't care what you think about this. We've got 60 votes. Sit down, shut up. Is that the way the United States Senate is to operate? I don't think so. I don't think that was what was envisioned when this body was put together. And it's been forever changed. It happened because Obamacare is out of control. It's not the website. The website was a mess. It just proved to us that the White House couldn't manage this. That's what it proved to us. But, you know, you can fix a website. You can get smart people. They can go in and figure it out. That wouldn't be me, but there's many people in the United States who could be brought to bear to solve this problem, to deal with the website. It's not the website, although it's a huge embarrassment. It was a huge embarrassment for the White House. It was a huge embarrassment for the President of the United States. It was a huge embarrassment for Kathleen Sebelius. It was a huge embarrassment for the Democrats who voted for this. But at the end of the day, you can fix it. And I would guess they would fix it. I kept saying to people back home, I think it'll get fixed. You know, how tough is that? How tough would it be to do it the right way the first time? But they didn't. It just proves they're not very competent. But what is happening here is that the wheels are coming off this policy because the policy never made any sense. When the president made this announcement, insurance companies, you fix it, the America's health insurance plan said Premiums have already been set for the next year based on the assumption of when consumers will transition into the new marketplace. Now, who decided when they would transition into the new marketplace? The insurance companies did. The majority did. The White House did. Health and Human Services did. They go on in their statement, if now fewer younger and healthier people choose to purchase coverage, in the exchange, premiums will increase and there will be fewer choices for consumers. Well, let me say something that is obvious to everybody in this chamber. Your premiums are going up. Why? Because young people are so turned off. Young people are so turned off by what's happening here. I had a young person show up at a town hall. This was a year and a half ago. They said, you know, Mike, here's kind of the deal. It's just my wife and I. We don't have children. We're both working. We're trying to get ahead. We don't make a lot of money. And we decided that the best plan for us was kind of a catastrophic plan. We'll deal with our day-to-day health care needs, which incidentally aren't much because we're young and fortunately we're healthy. We've got a high deductible. I'm listening to that and I said, you know what? God bless it. This is America. They can make that choice. That was the best choice for them. They thought about it. They decided that the money that they were making might be better allocated someplace else. What a great country that you can decide that. Well, what happened with this health care bill, Mr. President? That decision was taken away from that young couple. They were ordered by the federal government under penalty to buy a given plan. Now, I'm not caught up with that young couple, but I'll bet they're mad as wet hens. I'll bet that they're looking at what has happened to them and they're saying, why? And we all know the little secret here. Young people are paying more for coverage that they don't need to finance me in my 60s. Does that make any sense? Mr. President, I could go on and on about what is happening here with this health care bill. But it's not a sheer coincidence that gentlemen and gentlewomen in the Senate reached an agreement months ago on the rules. We shook hands on it. We put that behind us. And all of a sudden, right about the time that Obamacare rolled out, all of a sudden, that agreement wasn't valid anymore. And we got set up on a manufactured crisis to force a vote. And the method chosen to change the rules forever changes how the Senate operates. In our history, many senators had the opportunity to change these rules. Thought better of it. Because they so respected and admired this institution that they believed there was a place for a minority, whether that senator was in the minority or the majority at the time. That's what happened here. And I will take another step. All of us know what this is really about. This is about control of this body. And all of a sudden, because of Obamacare and the truth coming out about what a terrible piece of policy this is, it became evident that members over here were in deep, deep trouble. and were going to lose their elections if their elections were held now. And the majority had to change the conversation. So the agreement that we reached after that night we spent in the old Senate chamber hashing through this, debating and discussing it, basically got torn up and tossed out the window, and the majority forever changed how this body will operate and what this body is going to be about in the future. So, Mr. President, what I say to you tonight is this. I am not planning on being here much longer. I've made that decision. You could say I don't have a boxer in the ring. You know, a year from now, I'll be doing something else. Some will be here, some won't be here. But at the end of the day, what I'll remember about this time in the United States Senate is that a precedent has been set that is vastly different than the way this Senate operated for 225 years. A precedent was set that allows the majority to take control of executive branch appointments, district court appointments, circuit court appointments. It is a precedent that would allow a majority to take control of a Supreme Court appointment, and it is a precedent that will allow a majority, when it chooses to, not if, I believe it's a question of when, that will allow a majority to take control of the policy making. So it is true when we say, if you were attempting to change the conversation, majority members of the United States Senate, away from Obamacare to this, all you have done is reminded the American people that what you are really doing is abusing this institution in a way that, quite honestly, is going to be very, very hard to turn around. My thought is this. I feel very, very strongly that we can reverse what has occurred here. But we can't do it as a minority. We need the majority to back off. We need the majority to recognize that this body has existed through difficult times. It has existed through wars. It has existed through attacks on our country, and it found a way to operate. We need the majority to recognize that we reached an agreement many months ago after an evening spent together in the old Senate chambers, where we debated these things, and like gentlemen and women, we shook hands and put this behind us for this session. We can do the work of the United States Senate. We can do the work for the American people. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. I am very concerned, though, that we have put the United States Senate in a position where it is a very, very vulnerable body now. Any majority can now use this precedent to turn this into something that is entirely different than what anybody who founded this country believed it should be. When the majority decided that it would bypass the requirement that rules would be changed by a two-thirds vote and do it by appealing the ruling of the chair, They put the United States Senate in a position where there are no rules. There are no rules. All you need is 51 members, 50 if you have the vice president in the chair, who decide to stick together and make that Supreme Court appointment. They can get it done. All you need is 50 members if you have a vice president in the chair who decides they stick together and they would do a legislative process by a majority vote. Many, many times the nuclear option was discussed, it was debated, and senators much wiser than myself looked at the history of this great country and its history of this great country and its future and decided it was a step that should never be taken. That was until a couple of weeks ago, all driven by the fact that this piece of legislation called Obamacare has turned out to be such a train wreck, and that there was a need to change the discussion and change the topic and try to draw the people's attention away from that legislation. And that's how this rule got adopted. It's a sad time in our nation's history. It is a sad time in terms of what's going on. And what I would offer, Mr. President, is my hope is that wise people will realize the problems that they have created for this country in the future, realize that the precedent they have set forever changes the way we operate, and back away from what occurred. Let's start doing the work of the Senate. That means we work through Christmas, good. I'm here. If that means we work on weekends, if that means we work around the clock, fine with me. I'm good. I'll do it. I'll be happy to do it. But to try to streamline this process in a way that silences the minority is not right, and it's not what this country should be about. Mr. President, I yield the floor.